This is Gary Atencio with CNTV, and today we're in Boulder, Colorado. I'm here at the Safehouse Progressive Alliance for Nonviolence. Since 1979, this organization has been committed to ending violence against adults, youth, and children. I'm joined by Ann Tapp, who is the Executive Director. Thanks so much for joining us here today. Let's start off a little bit about yourself. I mean, first of all, the organization has spanned 40 years, quite a long time here in Boulder. You have been part of this through many milestones. You've seen quite a bit of changes. You were first the Program Director, became the Executive Director. Tell me a little bit how you got involved with the organization and why.
Well, it's been an honor to be part of the organization. I'm about to celebrate my 28th year here. I know. And it's an incredible organization with people who are passionate and committed. It's grown over the years that I've been here, and my hope is that as we continue past this 40th anniversary milestone, that eventually we'll work ourselves out of business.
That would be wonderful. I mean, honestly, it takes only a person to view your website and to see the stats right there on that front page. Not stats just across the United States, across the world, but even stats locally, right here in Boulder. Pretty staggering. Is it safe to say, and sadly enough to say, that this is an organization that is needed today just as much as it was back in the late 70s when it began?
It is, and I imagine 40 years ago when our foremothers were putting the organization together, they weren't imagining 40 years later that we would still be as needed as we are. In Boulder County, unfortunately, has a higher domestic violence rate than the state or national average, which I think is oftentimes shocking to people who live in the community. We know that there are about 1,800 calls to law enforcement in this county each year, and that's about only 1 in 10 survivors call the police. So that's about 18,000 calls, which is 50 a day, if you can imagine that.
That is something. I mean, where there is violence, there is a victim. And I would have to say that the victims out there, one thing that they probably all feel at one time, regardless of the situation, is very alone. I mean, is that what you're basically designed to do, to make them feel not so alone?
It is, and I think you're absolutely right that survivors feel a lot of guilt and shame and embarrassment, oftentimes, to come forward. So part of our work is to reduce the stigma so that someone who's experiencing violence in their relationship knows that, one, knows that there's a place to reach out, and two, feels comfortable doing that with us.
Feeling comfortable for a place to reach out. Maybe some out there have a friend or a family member who they can reach out to. We've all heard somebody say, hey, I'm here for you. But when you start realizing the scope of I'm here for you, what that really means, and it's usually up and above what an individual can do. Why is it important for folks out there to align themselves with an organization of actually professionals, volunteers that have been there and they understand what you're going through?
Mm-hmm. Much of what our advocates and counselors do is work with the survivor around safety planning. And it seems a little counterintuitive, but one of the most dangerous times for a survivor is immediately following leaving a relationship. So when the community or even friends or family say, just get out of there, just leave, that for many survivors is the point where the violence becomes lethal. And if you can think of some of the real tragic homicides or even suicide homicides, they are oftentimes after someone's trying to leave. So that really is an important time for a survivor to connect with an advocate that can talk through what are safety planning options, what are some strategies that are going to increase the likelihood that they're going to be safe, and what are the resources? What are how does the legal system work? How do you do this? How do you separate yourself from someone who's controlling and abusive?
I mean, quite honestly, like you say, someone out there who's trying to help. Yes, it's nice to have a shoulder to cry on, but eventually you need some tools. You need some strategies. You need some real plans put together by professionals who have done this before. Let's talk about some of those tools. First of all, is it important that the victim gets educated? How important is education in what you do? Explain to them what they've gone through. Explain that it's not their fault. Share with me the education aspect of the organization.
Well, when we're working with survivors, part of what we're trying to do is understand what their experience has been, and really kind of recognize that they are the experts in their own lives and their own experiences, and draw from that, and to provide more information about what a cycle of violence looks like, what are some dynamics that they may have been experiencing. If they have children, what does trauma look like in kids? And just, kind of fill in the pieces. For the community, much of our education is again, it's kind of dismantling a lot of the stereotypes and myths about domestic violence, and focusing on what are the things that we can do to prevent violence. As an organization, our focus is on survivors and kids. But equally, we should be, as a community, looking at who's perpetrating violence and how do we actually change a culture that allows for abuse to take place in families.
So it's not only the education on the back end when something happens, but actually a proactive education, getting into the schools, getting into the programs, making youth out there understand what's cool and what's not cool. Those are big things that I think will stop the end of this, and that's something that is important to you, that outreach in the community as well as the schools. Is that a big part of the organization?
It is. We have a school program, so we do violence prevention curricula with elementary, middle, and high school youth. We have a high school peers building justice program, which is a cohort of youth that are involved in social activism and really are taking a leadership role among their peers in challenging the culture of violence. And then our community education and training program reaches about 5,000 community members each year. So as you're saying, we really, our goal is to prevent violence before it happens. We recognize that that's a lofty goal, and so, we are going to continue to do the work with survivors, but do what we can to prevent the prevalence.
One of the most powerful tools that you provide is a hotline. I mean, violence occurs 24/7. You never know when it's going to come in. One more reason why people don't want to reach out to their family member. You don't want to get a phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning. You're embarrassed to make that phone call. This crisis, this hotline, 24/7. Tell me what they're going to find at the other end of that line when they make that call.
Well, it's a incredibly important resource, and we respond to about 8,800 crisis calls each year. So lots of volume, and some of the calls are from people who are just need information, either for themselves. This is happening in my relationship. I don't know if this is okay. What options do you think I have? And it's a confidential crisis line, and for a lot of survivors, kind of that first step of just trying to get a feel for what's happening and what are my options and where can I turn to for help. Sometimes the crisis line caller is a family member or friend who's worried about someone in their lives and wants to know, what's the right thing to say, what's the wrong thing to say. But it's an entry point for a lot of survivors, and for someone that needs shelter, that's the starting point. So they call the crisis line, work with the shelter advocate around.
That is wonderful. I mean, I think it's important for the public to know also that this is a phone call that is free. It doesn't cost them anything, and it's confidential. I mean, it's something that you're not worried about somebody else talking about. That has to be important as well. Do you think the hotline is something that people use almost as an educational tool as well, and not only just reaching out help for themselves?
They do. The hotline can be a place to, again, just get information if you're concerned about someone in your life. You want to understand what are the resources available to people experiencing violence, or to get some very specific questions answered, like how do you get a protection order, or what's going to happen if I call the police, or what are the counseling services that you can provide my kids who seem like they're distressed.
Some of these folks who call, they sometimes immediately find themselves in the need for shelter. I mean, that night. In 2008, he broke ground on a shelter that basically is able to house 27 recipients. It's been a real success for the program and the organization. Share with me, is that important, the emergency shelter, as far as people being able to back it up and support?
Yeah, this shelter is a life-saving resource, literally. And 40 years ago, we started in an old, like 100-year-old, renovated, kind of broken down, but loving home, where we could shelter 12 people. And in 2008, we were able to build a new facility that's just it's a fabulous resource in the community. And while we were sheltering almost 400 adults and kids each year, we're turning away almost 1,400 requests for shelter because the facility's at capacity. So the need for emergency shelter is great.
That's something. That's amazing. That much need out there where you're still turning away some. I mean, obviously, these folks find themselves in need of shelter immediately that night. I mean, the first step is just getting out of the situation. Then eventually they find that they sometimes go back because of the fact that the long-term shelter is not there. Long-term housing, is that something that you help educate with them as well? Find out what programs are available as far as the transitioning into something new.
Yeah, we've been fortunate to actually develop a housing and economic justice program, and with resources from the federal government, but local and some state resources, we're able to help survivors move from emergency shelter into housing. And that's no easy feat here in Boulder County, where the cost of housing is incredibly high. And where, a survivor who may have left a job for safety reasons or is trying to rebuild their credit is competing with people whose lives aren't in crisis, but also need affordable housing. So it's a tough road. And our housing advocates work directly with the shelter clients and survivors who may not be in shelter but are in dangerous housing situations to find what housing programs may be available. We do have some funds where we can subsidize housing as survivors are getting back on their feet. But as you note, it's an incredible barrier, and it is one of the reasons why someone may return to an abusive relationship. Is if it's between dealing with an abuser or living in my car with my kids, that's a tough decision to make.
A decision no one should have to make, and obviously that's why more support is needed out there as well. I mean, obviously the first step is making that call, finding out about the program, finding out information, but someone who's gone through a tragedy like this, it's lifelong, it's life-changing. Share with me how counseling is an important factor when it comes to helping them transition maybe into the next relationship and beyond.
Yeah, the trauma of surviving violence is for a lot of survivors, as you note, is lifelong. Our counseling program works with close to 800 adults, youth, and kids each year, and the focus is really to address the impact that violence has had in their lives, and to begin to rebuild some of those kind of emotional strengths that help someone kind of move through trauma and crisis and begin to trust themselves again, and to realize that there are good people and good resources in the community for them.
And it's not only counseling for the victims, but even for the counseling that are, even for those that are subjected to this, even those who have seen it. I imagine for a child, it's much different. The impact is counseling provided for children as well, and is that something you can direct them to?
Yeah, you're right. The impact on kids can be just monumental, and I think just generally we're learning more about what you call adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and kids' exposure to violence, along with the homelessness that can come with domestic violence, are factors that are risk factors for kids. The counseling that we provide children is really focused on, again, recognizing what their strengths are, building on those strengths, and helping kids to learn new strategies to deal with their own internal distress. So we have both paid and intern counselors that work with kids through play therapy, art therapy. We just completed a summer camp a few weeks ago with a group of kids, and so much of childhood is really very much about kids learning how to be in relationship with each other, and much of our counseling focuses on how they learn how to be with kids, how they can also learn to trust the adults in their lives again.
Also a form of prevention right there, just learning how to do it in a healthy way. This is an organization that has spanned over 40 years here. It's very powerful. You're providing advocacy, support, education, but a big piece of what you do really is in the community and community programs, outreach. Is that vital for you here in the area?
Yes, much of our work really happens outside of the doors of this building and outside of the shelter, and creating partnerships with other community organizations, other nonprofits that are working with families. Also working in neighborhoods. We really, we want to take the issue of domestic violence out from the shadows and really work with whether it's faith communities or organizations, schools, to look at ways that we can both educate ourselves and educate each other, but also create a more cohesive community so that when violence does happen, and unfortunately it probably will continue, then we have community networks that really wrap around the survivor and kids, and also to shift the focus solely from just survivors and look at the people who are using violence, and how, what's the responsibility of the community to work with abusers and help to shift that behavior.
This is an organization that began back in the late 70s. It started out with 3 on the staff, 25 volunteers. They have now provided over 90,000 stays through your shelter, which is incredible. Thousands of meals provided, thousands of children, women, adults who have been housed. What can the public do out there as far as the individual, not just the corporations, but the individuals who can maybe volunteer and be a part of that as well? Because after all, it takes a village to raise a child, but it takes a village to raise us all up and help one another.
Well, what we all can do is get involved, get invested, get interested, be informed, both so that we can be a better support to the people in our lives that may be experiencing violence, but also so that we can impact the community in a positive way. We have volunteer opportunities ranging from volunteers that help with childcare, help answer the crisis line, help in our court programs, support special events. So there are many volunteer opportunities, kind of self-serving, and it is, but give money. Exactly. People think that nonprofits run, we run on a shoestring budget, but we have bills to pay, and in order to do the work, we really do need the community to not just volunteer their time, but also their treasure.
Lastly, Ann, let me ask you this. I explained at the beginning that you have been here with the organization through many milestones. You said it was basically an honor to serve in this capacity. You've experienced the groundbreaking in 2008 of a shelter that started in much humbler situation before that. You've been the recipient of grants from a government that didn't even recognize this for many years. You have seen children that are pulled out of situations and women pulled out of situations. Does this continue to be rewarding for you?
Yeah, it's my heart work, and each day I wrap up business in my office and walk down the hall and see photos of survivors that we've worked with, and it's touching. In addition to the incredibly courageous people that walk through our doors, we have staff and volunteers that are the most dedicated, passionate, good, kind people, and to be surrounded by that kind of generosity and love and courage is just, it's certainly been a blessing in my life.
That is fantastic. Viewers, let's take a look at the bottom of the screen right there. What you're going to see is their website. On the website, first of all, learn a little bit more about this organization, what their mission statement is. They have survived here in the Boulder County area for 40 years, for 4 decades. They've been helping the community out there. They need your help. They need input. They basically are an organization that survives, like she said, because of the volunteers, donations from the community. Once again, that's the Safehouse Progressive Alliance for Nonviolence, working together to create positive social change and end violence for good. This is Gary Atencio with CNTV. And if you don't know, now you know.